Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back and welcome to the 45th episode of Mondays with Margaret. Today we are going to be talking about In Other Worlds, SF and the Human Imagination. This is the last nonfiction book of the series, and this book was published in 2011. So we have entered the final decade of Atwood's writing so far. If you've watched some of my earlier Mondays with Margaret videos, I had mentioned a few weeks ago now that Atwood is publishing her next nonfiction book in March of 2022, so 11 years after this one. It's also interesting that this book, which is all about science fiction, was published between The Year of the Flood, which we just talked about, and the last book in the Mad Adam series, or Mad Adam trilogy, which is titled Mad Adam. This book is divided into 3 parts. The first part has 3 chapters, and these are the chapters that I'm going to focus on, which I will explain why when I get to the second and third part. So the 3 chapters in part 1 begin with Atwood sharing her own relationship with science fiction, beginning from her childhood. And I wanted to read a bit of this to you since it gives some of the biographical background of Atwood's love for science fiction. So this begins on page 15. I entered the sort of modern wonder tale world we might generally label SF at an early age. I grew up largely in the north woods of Canada, where our family spent the springs, summers, and falls. My access to cultural institutions and artifacts was limited. Not only were there no electrical appliances, furnaces, flush toilets, schools, or grocery stores, there was no TV, no radio shows available, except for those on shortwave Russian stations, no movies, no theater, and no libraries. But there were a lot of books. These ranged from scientific textbooks to detective novels, with everything in between. I was never told I couldn't read any of them, however unsuitable some of them may have been. I learned to read early so I could read the comic strips because nobody else would take the time to read them out loud to me. The newspaper comic pages were called then the funny pages, although a lot of the strips were not funny but highly dramatic. Like Terry and the Pirates, which featured a femme fatale called the Dragon Lady, who used an amazingly long cigarette holder, or oddly surreal like Little Orphan Annie. Where were her eyes? The funny papers raised many questions in my young mind, some of which remain unanswered to this day. What exactly happened when Mandrake the magician gestured hypnotically? Why did the Princess Snowflower character go around with a cauliflower on either ear? And if those weren't cauliflowers, what were they? In addition to being a comics reader, I was an early writer and I drew a lot. Drawing and reading were the main recreations available in the woods, especially when it was raining. Very little of what I wrote or drew was in any way naturalistic, and in this I suspect I was like other children. Those under the age of 8 gravitate more easily toward talking animals, dinosaurs, giants, flying humanoids of one kind or another, whether fairies, angels, or aliens, than they do to, say, portrayals of cozy domestic interiors or bucolic landscapes. Draw a flower was what we used to be taught in school, and by that was meant a tulip or a daffodil. But the kinds of flowers we really liked to draw had more in common with Venus flytraps, only a lot bigger and with half-digested arms and legs sticking out of them. I revisited my early non-naturalistic tendencies during a recent trip I took through my own juvenilia, or what survives of it. When I say juvenilia, I'm not talking about the precocious teenage poems of William Blake or John Keats, but about things that I was doing in the mid-1940s when I was 6 or 7. They centered around my superheroes who were flying rabbits. Their names were Blue Bunny and White Bunny, and they were modeled upon 2 unimaginatively named real-life stuffed animals who did indeed go flying through the air propelled by an age-old technology called throwing. But it wasn't long before these feasible heroes morphed into 2 tougher creatures called Steel Bunny and Dottie Bunny, who flew in a more conventional superhero way by means of capes. Steele's cape had bars on it, Dottie's had dots. So far, so clear. My superhero rabbits were pale imitations of my older brother's more richly endowed creations. It was he who invented flying rabbits, extraterrestrial flying rabbits. His were equipped with vehicles and advanced technologies, spaceships, airplanes, weaponry, the lot, and did battle not only with their hereditary enemies, the evil foxes, but with robots and man-eating plants and lethal animals. The planet where my brother's rabbits lived was called Bunnyland. Mine inhabited a more mysterious place called Mischiefland. Now what impelled me to name it that? The rabbits in Mischiefland led a disorganized existence. They floated around by means of balloons, unavailable during the Second World War, and thus of great fascination to me. Also, I had by this time read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, in which the wizard goes soaring away in a basket lifted by an enormous hot air balloon. I allowed not only my rabbits but their pet cats to be levitated in this way. I was not permitted to have a cat and longed for one, so my rabbits had a lot of them. The rabbits ate nothing but ice cream cones, rare and desirable during wartime, and the several lean years that followed. And they did tricks, specifically a lot of twirling in the air, and the aid of their flying capes. They were only fitfully interested in shooting guns, pursuing criminals, saving the world, and so forth. Though they did eject the occasional bullet from the occasional handgun, smiling eerily while doing it. But mostly it seems they just wanted to have fun and fool people. Where did we kids discover the knowledge of flying capes, superpowers, other planets, and the like? In part through the primitive comic strip superheroes of the time, the most popular of which were Flash Gordon for space travel and robots, Superman and Captain Marvel for extra strength, superpowers, and cape-based flying, and Batman, who was immortal with a non-functional cape, one that must have encumbered him somewhat as he clawed his way up the sides of buildings, but who nonetheless shared with Captain Marvel and Superman a weak or fatuous second identity that acted as a disguise. Captain Marvel was Billy Batson, the callow news reporting youth. Superman was Clark Kent, the bespectacled reporter. Batman was Bruce Wayne, the very rich playboy who lounged around in a smoking jacket. Those crossed with the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a dollop of Greek mythology, and our one small book on the solar system were probably the source of our core ideas. I think this shows Atwood's imagination from a very young age, and she continues talking about, where the ideas for science fiction come from. She talks about the clothing, such as the capes and masks, as well as double identities like Superman and Clark Kent. And then, of course, there's the superpowers like flying and transformations and tricks. And Atwood even says that many of these airborne non-humans tend to have an odd sense of humor. And Atwood describes Batman as an almost perfect case study for a comic book character leading a split life and engaging in a battle between good and evil that might show some Jungian characteristics. In the second chapter, Atwood talks about her adolescent relationship with science fiction. And I'm going to share a bit about what she says about this period of her life as well. And this begins on page 39. Between the ages of 11 and 17, I read M.R. James, the master of the creepy tale, and all of H.G. Wells' fantastical stories, The War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The Country of the Blind, and many more. Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, complete with dinosaurs and primitive man, was a favorite. So were H. Rider Haggard's once highly popular King Solomon's Mines, Alan Quatermain and She, with their lost civilizations frequently ruled over by beautiful, shoulder-bearing, drapery-fluttering queens, and whatever derivatives, boys' own annual adventure stories I could get my hands on. It goes without saying that I was in love with Sherlock Holmes, and once I got around to it, with Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade, and Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe as well. There is something to be said about a great coat or trench coat, a back alley, and a clenched jaw. And that none of these men au fond had much respect for women did not bother me a whit. The blonde usually did it, and I was not a blonde. I also read a lot of SF. As I proceeded through high school, I dug into the John Wyndhams, The Day of the Triffids, came out in 1951, The Midwich Cuckoos in 1957. I devoured any Ray Bradbury's I could get. It was the 1950s, so The Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit 451 were both available. I often read this kind of book when I was supposed to be doing my homework. I was in fact leading a double life, or even a triple one. The terms highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow were much in use at that time. The metaphor was based on some idea of Neanderthals having receding foreheads, but I seem to have a taste for all three kinds of brow, which I can't say disturbed me. In the classroom we took Shakespeare, a play or two a year, and the Romantic and Victorian poets among others. Over the 5 years of high school that were mandated there and then, we studied 2 novels each of George Eliot, Charles Dickens, and Thomas Hardy, and we studied them very thoroughly. So it was serious highbrow business during the day, but after school, I could lower my brow and indulge in my guilty pleasures. Donovan's Brain, the Kraken Wakes, and their ilk. This pattern continued once I was at university, except my escapism expanded to include double-bill B sci-fi movies of the lowest possible brow level. I saw The Fly when it first came out, and the attack of the 60-foot woman whose growth in size rendered her semi-transparent, and The Head That Wouldn't Die, and The Creeping Eye. A giant eye with tentacles that came from outer space like a lot of threatening things in those days, and that, when it finally put in an appearance, had tractor treads clearly visible beneath it. Meanwhile, in my highbrow guise, I was making my way through English literature from Anglo-Saxon to T.S. Eliot, and French literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, and going to Ingmar Bergman and Nouvelle Vague films. In this chapter, she also talks about Northrop Frye and how he talked about the Bible as literature, and she talks about myths being stories, but not all stories are myths. And I can definitely see this theme in her writing. Especially in the Mad Adam trilogy that we are currently reading for this series. Something interesting that I thought, anyway, in this section was the 4 ways that science fiction narratives are different than novels. And this begins on page 62. And she says, here are some of the things SF narratives can do that novels, as usually defined, cannot do. They can explore the consequences of new and proposed technologies in graphic ways by showing them as fully operational. They can explore the nature and limits of what it means to be human in very explicit ways by pushing the human envelope as far as it will go in the direction of the not quite human. SF narratives can also interrogate social organization by showing what things might be like if we rearrange them. Sometimes they are used primarily as a way of reconsidering gender structures. Finally, SF stories can explore the outer reaches of the imagination by taking us boldly where no man has gone before, or indeed ever. So I thought it was interesting how she broke that down. Chapter 3 is for all the map lovers out there. Whether it's science fiction or not, I do love when a map is included in a book. Atwood says that writing about the real world and a fictional world are 2 very different things. And for science fiction, maps and a state of mind are part of the story. She says that any writer of utopias and dystopias have to consider 3 questions. Where is it? When is it? And in relationship to maps, what shape is it? In this chapter, Atwood talks about her unfinished thesis, which is called The English Metaphysical Romance, and it has 2 parts, titled The Power of Nature and The Nature of Power. Now, Atwood never finished her thesis because her writing career started taking off, but she does talk in this section about how she came to the point to write, at least up until the point of publishing this book, 3 of her own utopias. So namely The Handmaid's Tale, Oryx and Crake, and Year of the Flood. So we've already gone over the story of what inspired Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, but I am going to read what she says in this book about beginning it, and that's on page 86. Why did I jump the tracks, as it were, from realistic novels to dystopias? Was I slumming, as some literary writers are accused of doing when they write science fiction or detective stories? The human heart is inscrutable, but let me try to remember what I thought I was up to at the time. First, The Handmaid's Tale. What put it into my head to write such a book? I had never done anything like it before. My previous fiction had been realistic. Tackling a utopia was a risk, but it was also a challenge and a temptation, because if you've studied a form and read extensively in it, you often have a secret hankering to try it yourself. I began the book after a few earlier dry runs, in Berlin in the spring of 1984. I had a DAAD fellowship in a program run by West Berlin to encourage foreign artists to visit. As the city was at that time encircled by the Berlin Wall, and its inhabitants felt understandably claustrophobic. During our stay, we also visited East Berlin, as well as Poland and Czechoslovakia, and I thus had several first-hand experiences of the flavor of life in a totalitarian but supposedly utopian regime. I wrote more of the book once I was back in Toronto, and I completed it in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in the spring of 1985, where I was the holder of an MFA chair. Tuscaloosa in Alabama provided another kind of flavor, that of a democracy, but one with quite a few constraining social customs and attitudes. Don't ride a bike, I was told. They'll think you're a communist and run you off the road. The writing of The Handmaid's Tale gave me a strange feeling like sliding on river ice, exhilarating but unbalancing. How thin is this ice? How far can I go? How much trouble am I in? What's down there if I fall? These were writerly questions having to do with structure and execution, and that biggest question of all, the one every writer asks him or herself with every completed chapter: is anyone going to believe this? I don't mean literal belief. Fictions admit that they are invented right on the cover. I mean, find the story compelling and plausible enough to go along for the ride. These writerly questions were reflections of other, more general questions. How thin is the ice on which supposedly liberated modern Western women stand? How far can they go? How much trouble are they in? What's down there if they fall? And further, if you were attempting a totalitarian takeover of the United States, how would you do it? What form would such a government assume, and what flag would it fly? How much social instability would it take before people would renounce their hard-won civil liberties in a trade-offs for safety? And since most totalitarianisms we know about have attempted to control reproduction in one way or another, limiting births, demanding births, specifying who can marry whom, and who owns the kids, how would that motif play out for women? And what about the outfits? Utopias are always interested in clothing, either less of it compared to what we wear now, that was popular in Victorian times, or more of it compared to what we wear now. The clothing concerns usually center around women. Societies are always uncovering parts of women's bodies and then covering them up again. Maybe this is just to keep things interesting. Now you see it, now you don't, though the it changes a lot. What was it that used to be so very alluring about a trim set of ankles? My rules for The Handmaid's Tale were simple. I would not put into this book anything that humankind had not already done, somewhere, sometime, or for which it did not already have the tools. Even the group hangings had precedents. There were group hangings in earlier England, and there are still group stonings in some countries. For a literary precedent, one need search no further than Emile Zola's Germinal, which contains an episode in which the town's coal-mining women who have been sexually exploited by the shopkeeper tear the man apart and parade his genitalia through town on a pole. A less raw but still shocking precedent is Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery, which I read as a teenager shortly after it came out, and which made a chilling impression on me. The cover-ups worn by the women in The Handmaid's Tale have been variously interpreted as Catholic, as in nuns, or Muslim, as in burqas. The truth is that these outfits are not aimed at any one religion. Their actual design was inspired by the old Dutch cleanser figure on the sink cleaner boxes of my childhood, but they are also simply old. Mid-Victorians with their concealing bonnets and veil to keep strange men from leering at their faces would not have found them so unusual. 18 years later, Atwood wrote Oryx and Crake, and the last book we talked about, The Year of the Flood, was published in 2009. And since we just covered this book, I thought that I would share a bit of what Atwood has to say about that. And she talks about the title and some things that inspired her, and this begins on page 92. A sibling book, The Year of the Flood, was published in 2009. Its original title was God's Gardeners, but although this was perfectly acceptable to the British publisher, the American publisher and the Canadian publisher objected to it on the grounds that people would think the book was a far-right extremist tract, which goes to show how thoroughly the word God has been hijacked. Many other titles were proposed, including Serpent Wisdom, which the Canadian publisher liked, but which the US felt suggested a hippie New Age cult, and Eden Cliff, which the British thought sounded like a retirement home in Bournemouth. Book titles are either immediately obvious, like The Edible Woman, or the very hard to decide on The Year of the Flood was the second kind. The Year of the Flood explores the world of Oryx and Crake from a different perspective, whereas Jimmy Snowman, the protagonist of Oryx and Crake, has grown up within a privileged though barricaded enclave. The Year of the Flood takes place in the space outside such enclaves, at the very bottom of the social heap. Its pre-disaster plot unfolds in neighborhoods that the security forces, now melded with corporations, don't even bother to patrol, leaving them to criminal gangs and anarchic violence. However, this book too has a utopia embedded within a dystopia. It's represented by the God's Gardeners, a small environmental religious cult dedicated to the sacred elements in all creation. Its members grow vegetables on slum rooftops, sing sacred nature hymns, and avoid high-tech communications devices, such as cell phones and computers, on the grounds that they can be used to spy on you, which is entirely true. Oryx and Crake and The Year of the Flood cover the same time period, and thus are not sequels or prequels. They are more like chapters of the same book. They have sometimes been described as apocalyptic, but in a true apocalypse, everything on Earth is destroyed. Whereas in these two books, the only element that's annihilated is the human race, or most of it. What survives after the cataclysmic event is not a dystopia, because many more people would be required for that, enough to comprise a society. The surviving stragglers do, however, have mythic precedents. A number of myths tell of an annihilating flood survived by one man, or a small group, like Noah and his family. Do the surviving human beings in Oryx and Crake and The Year of the Flood represent a dystopic threat to the tiny utopia of genetically modified, peaceful, and sexually harmonious new humans that is set to replace them? As it is always the reader rather than the writer who has the last word about any book, I leave that to you. So that brings us to the end of part 1. Now, I said at the beginning of the video that I wasn't going to focus on part 2 or 3, and now I will explain why. Part 2 is a compilation of Atwood's reviews and commentaries on science fiction works, and these are all in second words and moving targets. So we have actually already covered all of these. Reading them again, though, in this context was interesting, and it makes sense to include them in this nonfiction book like this. So I was reminded in one of them about H.G. Wells, and it says this on page 155. Wells is acknowledged to be one of the foremost inventors in the genre we now know as science fiction. As Robert Silverberg has said, every time travel tale written since The Time Machine is fundamentally indebted to Wells. In this theme, as in most of science fiction's great themes, Wells was their first. Science fiction as a term was unknown to Wells. It did not make its appearance until the 1930s. In America during the golden age of bug-eyed monsters and girls in brass brassieres. Wells himself referred to his science-oriented fictions as scientific romances, a term that did not originate with him, but with a lesser-known writer called Charles Howard Hinton. The part 3 is called 5 Tributes, and again, we have already read these. Some of the excerpts are from Oryx and Crake, Good Bones, and The Blind Assassin. So we have covered these already in the series, but Atwood has included them here since they obviously fit the science fiction genre. So this book is a really interesting look at science fiction, the history and elements of it. If you are a science fiction fan, then there is probably something in this book that you would enjoy. And even if it's just the number of books that Atwood refers to. And it was also interesting to see how science fiction has influenced all of Atwood's writing, not just her dystopian or utopian novels. Please let me know if you have read In Other Worlds, and let me know what you thought of it. Or maybe let me know what you think of science fiction. Do you read that genre, and what do you think that books have to include in order to be considered science fiction? I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.